Oh, yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's CK Burch, and this is my Geek Review. This is my new Geek Review shirt. I figured I wanted to have something I could wear, display my geekiness whenever I'm doing the show. So I thought that I would get this cool Star Trek shirt. Happened to find it at Target. And what better way to inaugurate it than doing my geek review of Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. It's another coffee day, so I'm going to be a little energetic with this one. Now, with my geek reviews, I find that generally I have to consume alcohol when it's something that I'm really exuberant about and or really don't like. But if it's something that I'm going to get ultimately passionate about, and Star Trek is one of those things, it's going to be coffee. So, Star Trek V. Directed by William Shatner, based around a story written by Shatner and a couple of other folks. Herb Bennett and David Lowery. Star Trek V is probably considered universally the most hated of the Star Trek films. It is, it's hard to find a different Star Trek film that is lower on the list of the, of everyone's personal favorites. For me, the absolute worst of the Star Trek franchise would be Star Trek Generations. For good reasons, but this is not that review. This is Star Trek V. And so, let's start with the basic plot. So, the film opens up, and a mysterious Vulcan who displays emotions and some strange telepathic abilities lands on the planet of Nimbus 3 and takes hostage a couple of ambassadors from different planets. One's a human, one's a Klingon, and one's a Romulan. So naturally there's some diplomatic and political interest there. We cut away to find Kirk, Spock, and McCoy enjoying their shore leave, while the crew of the Enterprise A is attempting to put the Enterprise A together. So, for context's sake, in Star Trek IV, we see the crew of the Enterprise come back after the whole the great trilogy of Star Trek films, 2, 3, and 4, in which you got Wrath of Khan, where Spock dies. You've got The Search for Spock, in which they discover that Spock's not actually dead. He just put his mind inside Dr. McCoy, and then his body regenerated on the planet Genesis. And then Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, in which they have to take a detour by going backwards in time to San Francisco 1986, before returning home to face the music for A, stealing the Enterprise, and then B, blowing it up. Yeah, Kirk's a bit of a rebel. So this is the first of the Star Trek films to actually feature the Starship Enterprise NCC 1701A, which was presented to the crew at the end of Star Trek IV. Now, the thing with this Enterprise is that it's kind of been hastily put together, which I always kind of surmised, because at the end of Star Trek IV, when they're presented with the Enterprise A as their new ship to jaunt around the universe with, I always wondered, how the hell did the Federation get that ship up and running so damn fast? And this movie, this entry in the franchise answers that question by saying, not very well. Not very well at all. So then they take the Enterprise A, which is in dire need of fixing up, and is running on only a skeleton crew, and they go off to stop this terrorist, who turns out to be Spock's half-brother. So, what did I think of this film? I really like this movie, and hear me out. I really like this movie. It's a decent entry into the genre. Now, there are problems with it, clearly. Otherwise, it wouldn't be as reviled as it is. I think part of why I like this film so much is nostalgia, because this is the only Trek film that I clearly remember going and seeing out of the original series as a child. I clearly remember going to the mall with my mom and my brother and seeing this film back in 1989. Now, one of the reasons I think that this film is also not so well received is because it didn't perform very well at the box office. 1989 was not a good year to go up against tentpole cinema. You had Ghostbusters 2, itself slightly reviled, but uh, we can get into that another time. You also had Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and you had a little film directed by Tim Burton called Batman. So you had a bunch of films at the box office that were just dominating, and Star Trek V wasn't one of them. Now, I believe that this is in part due to the fact that this film, as story-wise, just goes. And I was so surprised when I happened to turn and look to see how long the film had been on, and it had already been on for an hour. I was like, holy cow, this is going by. Let's get something out of the way. Shatner's direction is pretty spot on. His compositions are really nice, especially in the establishing shots on Nimbus 3, then when they're in Yosemite Park. He frames well, he directs well, and I don't think so many of the problems lie in the direction so much as they do in the story of the film. And I think Shatner gets a bit of a bad rap for the directing aspect of the film. For the most part, this film is really well directed. The story, however, and this is probably one of the reasons why I decided to make this my second My Geek review after Star Trek The Motion Picture, is that the story doesn't really stop to explain or to ponder some of the things that it brings up. Now, you've got the two probably most disliked Star Trek films out of the original series. You've got the motion picture, and you've got the Final Frontier. And depending on who you talk to, it's going to be one or the other is going to be at the lowest of the list. The thing with the motion picture is that where it brought to light some very heavy, big ideas and took its time to meditate and ponder these things and meander about, and unfortunately in the first half, way too long, Star Trek V doesn't really stop to go, hey, let's think about this. Let's measure the weight and the gravitas of the situation. You go from, we've got this terrorist guy who wants to take over a starship, to this guy has taken over the starship, and now we're heading to the center of the universe, to this great barrier, which no probe has ever returned from, and no starship has actually ever gone inside of. And there's a point of contention with that some people have, and I'll address that in a minute. But you go from that to suddenly, hey, we're going to the place where everything was created, to, hey, we're going to find God, to, we're meeting God, to, you're not God, to, God, we just zapped the alien thing that was God. This film runs at a very brisk pace. Things just kind of happen. And while it's fairly easy to follow, I mean, they don't really stop and get confusing, like, wait, what happened over here? How did that happen over there? It is brisk, but it doesn't stop to make you think. Now, there is a sequence closer towards the end of the film in which Sybok, who is Spock's half-brother from a Vulcan mother, but turns out to have be more in touch with his emotions than Spock is, ironically enough, Sybok, his deal is that he can, like, telepathically sense the pain of an individual. He can sense whatever it is that they've got boiled up inside of them, and he can get them to release that painful energy, and he absorbs it, simultaneously brainwashing them. Now, it's clear that the inspiration for this, and Shatner has said this multiple times, the inspiration for Sybok comes from televangelists who do that whole, like, head slap thing, and they brainwash people into following them and amassing so many more followers. And this is very clear in Sybok, and the actor Lawrence Luckinbill sells this The only problem is that the way the film establishes everything is that it's kind of impossible for the film to progress the way that it does with as little explanation as it has. 1 minute, Cybok has entered the ship. The next minute, Cybok has taken over the ship. Now, I get it. There's a skeleton crew on board. But when on the planet that Cybok has kidnapped these political prisoners, he actually has quite a few people under his command. Like he's got a pretty serious small force of armed men. And if those had ended up on board the Enterprise, I would have bought it. I wouldn't be sitting here questioning it. But as it stands, Cybok gets on board the Enterprise. Cybok takes over the Enterprise with like a handful of people after brainwashing Sulu and Uhura. That I mean, once they're even on board, Kirk just kind of goes, I'm now a prisoner on my own ship, and it's like, I get it. Okay, Cybok needs to take over the ship, but it just kind of happens. A lot of the stuff with the motion picture is that it's like, they went this needlessly complex route to get Kirk, Spock, and McCoy all on the ship at the same time. And here, they take the most simplistic route, and it just kind of happens. And to that end, the film falters. It happens a lot, too. Things just kind of happen. Even when it finally starts to get really interesting. They get down to the planet, and they finally are about to meet this god-type individual, and they're surrounded by rock outcroppings, and things start to get really kind of spooky and terrifying. The film totally captures the tone of the original series. Because this is what they did all the time. They went to alien planets. They discovered things that were weird and strange and godlike. I mean, the Squire of Gothos, Charlie X. I can't. In the episode where no man has gone before, I don't. Gary Mitchell with his ESP. They've encountered this before. This is nothing new to the Star Trek universe. Sorry, I had a text message interrupt my rooms. I had to turn my phone off for a second. But this is nothing new to the Star Trek universe. So, what's so different about it this time? Well, the fact that they just kind of go there and then fly away. The point of contention with the Great Barrier that people bring up is like, oh, well, no probe has ever returned, no ship has ever gone in there, but they seem to fly right through it pretty easily. Well, to the story's credit, and to the film's credit, they say very clearly, no probe has ever returned. Also, no ship has ever gone in there. Also, when they're flying through the Great Barrier, Chekhov has no readings whatsoever. He can't even tell if it's there or if it's not. Probably meaning that the Great Barrier itself is made of some type of energy that the Enterprise can't really register. So, how do they know if they're going to make it through? Especially if no probes have ever returned. Why send a ship through if a probe has never returned? People bring this up all the time. They say, well, it happened to go through really quickly. Look, even though the movie doesn't really stop and explain everything, it kind of clearly states, no one's ever gone through there. We've never had any probes come back out. Also, readings are all off. So I'm giving the movie a pass on that because they pretty much state it outright. And so the fact that Kirk and everybody are able to fly through the Great Barrier and the Klingons fly through right after them, I'm giving them film a pass because they establish the reasons why. So there you go. And the Great Barrier only exists to keep that god creature thing inside, not to necessarily keep things out. So it's probably composed of some type of energy field or whatnot that they can't really detect or play with. So, hey, there you go. I'm just saying. I'm giving the film a pass based on what they actually say in the film. If it says it in the film, if it's safe they can do it, well then, there you go. Now, what did I like about this film? Because I did like the film. Overall, I did like the film. I like that it was fast paced, despite the fact that they never stopped to talk about anything or weigh upon anything. I like the fact that we get a pretty decent amount of humor. Um, McCoy and Spock have some great banter in this, especially McCoy's line when he looks at Spock and says, "I liked him better before he died." It's great. It's a great line. It's some great humor. And Scotty and Uhura, kind of a thing? Yeah, I could see that. The chief engineer and the communications officer. I could totally see that being a thing. The crew get a lot of great interactions, even though they're brainwashed really easily. But it's established that Cybok is an excellent telepath. He's good at brainwashing people. In fact, Scotty manages to survive being brainwashed and not be indoctrinated, if you will, because he never actually comes into contact with Cybok. You never see them cross paths, so it's pretty easy to assume that they didn't actually cross paths. And that's why Scotty remains the hero in this film, because he's the only one who hasn't had his brain fucked with. In fact, McCoy almost went along with Cybok. The only reason Spock didn't is because he's Spock. Kirk has this great scene. All three, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, have this great scene where Cybok is showing them each their pain. It's a very powerful, very emotional sequence of events where you get such insight into each character, and it's equal time based on the character and their appropriate reactions. For example, McCoy has this fairly drawn out sequence where he sees the image of his dying father and he recalls the time that his father was in such pain and dying from his illness that McCoy decided to turn off the life support to relieve his father of his pain, but then weeks later they discovered a cure for this particular illness and he's been racked with guilt ever since. So he gives his pain to Cybok and he's cured of it. Then, for Spock, he sees a vision of his birth. He sees the reaction of his father, who so dismissively says of baby Spock, "He looks so human." And the impassive look on Spock's face, and this is a total credit to Leonard Nimoy's acting. It's all in his eyes. He doesn't say anything, says nothing, not a word. He just turns and walks away, and you can sense just how much of an impact that has on Spock. And then Kirk is presented with the same thing, but he refuses to see what his pain is. He refuses to acknowledge where he needs to release his pain with this great speech about how he doesn't want to get rid of his pain, how he needs his pain. "I need my pain." And it's a great moment. This is the only time in the film where I feel like the story actually stopped and went, "Okay, let's think about this. Let's draw this out and let's allow the story to breathe a little bit here." Because then, as soon as we turn right back around, Captain Kirk is let back onto the bridge after Cybok has taken it over, and he's let back onto the bridge with no force. He doesn't have to do anything. Nobody tries to stop him. Cybok is even like, "Hey, you're back." It just kind of happens, and that's really disappointing. Like, there was little to no conflict actually in the story. But I mean, the quicker paced elements held up, I felt, in the sequence where Kirk and the landing party are on Nimbus 3 and they're trying to get into Paradise City to take back the political prisoners from Cybok. It's actually a pretty well shot, well choreographed action sequence, and seeing Spock do the nerve pinch on a horse is really cool. The action sequence where they fly the shuttlecraft into the Enterprise shuttle bay manually, pretty tense actually. The crash sequence is really well shot. Even the sequence where, like, when things start to get intense and Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are trying to get away from the god creature at the end of the film, again, pretty intense and well directed. The only thing is that with that particular sequence, it just happens and then it's over, and then there we go. I cannot give Shatner. Um, I cannot blame him entirely for that. He came up with the story, but the screenplay is, I think, where these faults happens because, especially with the God creature, because there was a much more complicated sequence that was drawn up and put on the boards that they wanted to use, but then they couldn't, so they kind of had to half-ass it. And yeah, it's kind of half-assed. There was this great sequence, which would have been so very original series, in which the um, the god creature manifests as a bunch of rock creatures full of molten lava. That would have been really cool. But as it just happens. Special effects are decent, but it just happens. Now let's talk about the special effects, because we're looking at our polar opposites here. You've got the motion picture and you've got the final frontier, and wow, they're not completely terrible, but my god, for a Star Trek film, the special effects, this is the weakest in the series. It's this is the first. This was the first film where ILM was not a part of the special effects. Instead, they got a group out of Hoboken, New Jersey, to do the special effects, and you can tell a lot of the starships are done in stop motion. Ooh. Now, I like stop motion to a certain degree, but after going through 4 Star Trek films, you would think that Paramount would be like, okay, you've got the budget to do, decent special effects, but for some reason, man, they got cut off on this. You can see wires, you can see, you can visibly tell that their ships are moving in stop motion, and it's kind of bad. It kind of pulls you out of the film to see them moving so jarringly awkward, because there's a fluidity and there's a heaviness and a weight to the starships in the Trek universe that are not present here, not with these special effects. They feel very jerky and stilted, and they turn in awkward positions. And I have to admit, that's kind of a letdown, because if you're gonna do a Star Trek film, you gotta make sure your effects are looking good. I mean, these are, bar none, the worst effects in any of the films. I mean, the motion picture went all out, ladling on the effects to its own fault. And here, you can tell that the budget wasn't there, and that the film suffers as a result. But the dialogue and the character interactions are great. We get some great Kirk moments. We get some great Spock moments, some great McCoy moments, especially in the beginning. Chekhov and Sulu have a couple of really great scenes. Oh, Chekhov and Sulu, man. I like those guys a lot, especially when they're interacting with each other. And they get a couple of good scenes in here. Uhura, the whole crew get some good scenes. They get some good dialogue. We really, especially the trifecta, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, they interact really well with each other, and that's what sells the film. It's like, for me, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is not that great of a film. In fact, it's not that great until Indy and his dad come into contact with each other, because that's where all the magic lies, is in their interactions, and then that's where the film picks up. The film has its most strength when Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are interacting with each other, because they play off of each other. And this is clearly them having as much fun as they possibly can. There's a lot of energy, but the story doesn't really stop moving long enough to allow some of the heavier themes to play in. You've got God. You've got the planet of creation. Of course, it turns out to be illusions, but then Sybok mentions that he had a vision of this planet. We never get any of that previously. Something would have been nice, maybe just a quick image of Sybok having his vision, or sharing his vision beforehand. This wouldn't be the first time that a Vulcan has gotten a telepathic vision through space. Again, the motion picture, Spock feeling V'ger. So this is the spiritual twin to the motion picture, in kind of a mirror. Instead of being meandering and long, it's fast-paced and quick to the cut. Instead of having incredible special effects, it has really weak special effects. Instead of having big ideas and time to weigh upon them, it has interesting ideas, but no real payoff for any of them. So it just is a disappointment in that regard, yes. Now, as far as being a watchable Star Trek film, yeah, I'd totally sit down and watch this again. I would absolutely sit down and watch this film again, just like I would watch the motion picture again. The back half of motion picture. The motion picture felt like an episode from the second season of Star Trek. No, an episode from the first season of Star Trek, but drawn out way, way, way too long. And this, Star Trek The Final Frontier, feels like an episode from the end of the second season, but whoosh, just maybe extended. This film would have been served so much if they had opened it up just a little bit more and allowed the story to breathe, added in a few scenes, allowed things to progress more naturally rather than just jumping and going and being quick to the cut. The film is just a little too short and things happen a little too easily, but it's enjoyable and it's an interesting ride and I liked it. Man. Yes, so that is Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. Now, where would I rate it? Oh, it's so hard. It's so hard. I think I will rate it, I can't give it... Oh man, it's hard. It's hard because I like the film. I actually like the film. It's watchable. It's not awful. It is not as awful as people say it is. It just doesn't stop long enough to give us any sort of time to catch a breath and to actually think about what's going on. It's just slightly silly, but that's Star Trek. And it's just... No, it's not even corny. It's actually pretty poignant, especially with the character interactions between Sybok and Spock. I'm going to give it a 7.5. I did like it more than the motion picture because, as a total package, as a film, this movie is more watchable simply because it keeps your interest. It keeps your interest, and you don't have to... I didn't feel like, well, ooh, I felt, okay, I'm with you, okay. And for me, the character interactions and the, just the presentation of the film itself, the direction, it held my interest. And so I would rate this just slightly higher than the motion picture, if only for that. The special effects, oh, I wish they were better, but there's not much you can do about that in retrospect. And it is a little bit interesting now, watching this film, to see at the very end, now that the Klingon ship and the Enterprise, they've had their little adventure and everybody's okay for the moment, to have the Klingons on board the Starship Enterprise and to be drinking with the Enterprise crew, only for in the next film, Star Trek VI, where they have their diplomatic relations and no one on the Enterprise is happy that their Klingons are coming on board for drinks and dinner. So yes, granted they're far different situations, but yeah, this, as far as story is concerned, while interesting in idea, this is probably the weakest concept, or probably, yeah, it's the weakest concept, and while the execution is as solid as it could have been, it was definitely hampered, and it was far too rushed. So, but, I mean, for my money, that kind of beats how the motion picture just dragged everything out in the beginning and needlessly made things complicated and refused to kind of cut away from anything. Um, but yeah, so yeah, there you go. I'm giving it a 7.5. It's not a piece of shit. It's not. I mean, there are some elements that don't really sit well with me, but Cyborg is an interesting character. His interactions with Spock are interesting. The Kirk, Spock, and McCoy trifecta are there, and so I'm gonna give it 7.5. I almost would put it on the same level as a motion picture, but I just can't. Simply for pacing. Simply for pacing. And because I can actually sit down and watch this in its entirety without looking at the clock every 5 minutes. So, agree, disagree, comment. Tell me why you like this film or why you absolutely hate it. I mean, a lot of people do. Anyways, in the description, you can see where my blog is. You can see where you can find my books. I'm a writer, I'm an author. I've got books over on Amazon. You should go check it out. Science fiction and stuff like that. If you like the video, hit the like button. And now I'm done whoring myself out. So I hope to see you guys next week. I won't be doing a Star Trek film next week. I just wanted to get Star Trek 5 out of the way because, again, like I said, we got these two spiritual twins just put in the mirror, and, after watching them both again, I kind of had to do these two reviews back to back. And also, a Star Trek shirt. Star Trek shirt. Come on. But anyways, yes, that's it. This has been my Geek Review. I'm CK Burch.